Are you a history enthusiast looking for another new podcast? Dive deep into the captivating stories of Canada's past with a Historia Canadiana, as their hosts Patrick and Mackenzie work through this nation's history in a different and approachable fashion. Historia Canadiana unravels fascinating figures and pivotal events that have shaped the Great White North through a literary lens to offer listeners a richer understanding of Canada's heritage. Subscribe to the Historia Canadiana podcast, where history comes alive.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about culture, history, politics, and sometimes activism and history in the snowy land that we call Canada. Today, I have a historian with a PhD in history from the University of Toronto. He wrote the first book-length history of the Canadian disability rights movement, which was called Working Towards Equity, and has published variously on the topic of disability history and labor. He works as a personal historian, producing family and corporate history projects, and is currently working on his next book about the tragic death of a developmentally disabled man and the complicated quest for justice. Here to talk about his latest book, Beryl, The Making of a Disability Activist, I'm happy to have Dustin Galer. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So just to get listeners situated in this case, how would you actually describe this particular book on Beryl Potter and what it's trying to do?
Yeah, so this is a biography. This is a book that tracks the life of Beryl Potter. Beryl was born in Liverpool in the 1920s. She had a very troubled beginning to her life. She lost multiple close family members at a very young age and lived through obviously very desperate times during the Great Depression and the Second World War. Trouble sort of followed her to Toronto, where she immigrated in the 1950s. Her husband likely had PTSD from some terrible wartime experiences and found a welcome escape in alcoholism. She had terrible migraines that first introduced her to opioids, and she was later hospitalized for that. But her life took a very dramatic turn when a series of events led to the amputation of multiple limbs and her vision. And her very long time in hospital left her with an opioid addiction. She attempted suicide multiple times, not to mention the obviously devastating effect that it had on her family. But that's really just the early part of her story, because the person who returned from this journey was so amazing that she went on to become one of the most recognizable disability activists of the 1970s to the 1990s. She would regularly flash across television and newspaper headlines. People knew her, whether she was leading a protest on shut down Yonge Street or marching on Ottawa, people just knew her name. She was very articulate in front of the camera. And I think that's why the book's cover of her with like a bunch of microphones thrust in her face, that's how most people knew Beryl. But when she wasn't lobbying or protesting, she was in classrooms. She was a very dedicated childhood educator. She spoke to probably tens of thousands across the province of Ontario and beyond a little bit. And I actually met her as a 5-year-old school child, and that's part of my motivation for wanting to write her story, which I can talk about later. But Beryl always felt that children were our future doctors and policymakers, business leaders, and she felt strongly that having a positive imprintation of disability on children would eventually change the future, because children, hopefully that empathy was nurtured at a young age, and that they carry that into their working lives. And for her, that's how you make change. So that's just a little brief summary of what the book is about and the kind of woman that she was.
Yeah. And we'll get into more of those details a little bit later, but I wanted to give also listeners a bit of context into the world in which she emerged as a disability activist. Because I think most people listening would kind of take for granted a lot of the things that, there's still work obviously to be done, and we'll
Mm.
get to that for people with disabilities, but, kind of take for granted some of the adaptations that we might have in Canada for people with disabilities. So, what kind of historical context could help us set up the time when Beryl Potter was active? Like, basically, what were disability rights prior to her activism, and why was it so important for her to get into the life that we'll talk about a little bit?
Yeah, well, basically, prior to the point where she was active, which 1970s, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's basically no such thing as disability rights prior to the 70s.
As far as I
I
know,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, before that, um, our system was dominated by a charitable approach. Uh,
Mm.
and well, when you approach people from the position as objects of charity, there's really no consideration of their rights. And it really wasn't until 1975 when the Declaration on the Right that disability rights activists began to organize, push back. And so this was very much happening at the same time as Beryl was beginning to be active. So this is a time when public projects were just starting to make like sidewalks and places accessible, not very accessible. And they got a lot of things wrong, mostly because they didn't consult with people with disabilities, again, being objects of charity.
Classic.
Even curb cuts, as an example. When curb cuts were first introduced, it actually created new accessibility problems when the people who were blind were suddenly led into traffic. So they were trained to find the edge of a curb. It wasn't until they discovered, well, if you put some rumble strips there, then they will know when they've reached the edge. So things like that. Just these really early attempts at accessibility. And so she's really at the cusp.
It's really interesting. I actually never considered that, the idea of the, or the curves in sidewalks. That's
Yeah,
really interesting. Yeah, it's just kind of the things that you don't take into consideration when you're not someone who grows up with disabilities or anything like that. Wow. Cool. You
yeah.
learn something new every day, I guess.
Yeah, and people at the time would have if they had consulted with disabilities about their needs, they'd
Right,
know
exactly.
that this was a problem. So that was the early beginning of it.
Yeah, 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 for sure. And getting into this topic, I know that you're someone who has caregiving experience, right? So I'm kind of curious if there were any assumptions that you had in approaching Beryl Potter's life that perhaps were altered in researching the topic, and even how your own experience as a caregiver might have impacted your whole perspective on this research project.
Yeah, well, the great thing about Beryl is that I actually had very few, because I couldn't really figure out who she was when I first started researching this. I didn't know if she was an activist or if she was an advocate who worked with service agencies. These were two very different things. At the time, she seemed to straddle both, and so it was a little difficult to figure out who she was because working closely with service agencies at that time was something disability activists were working against. They were trying to push back against agencies that they felt had gobbled up most of the funding and spoke on behalf of the disability community. And so with her working closely with them, I wasn't sure where she stood. So it was only by digging very deep into her story that I discovered, who she was and why she was able to do the extraordinary things that she did. And I don't have all
Mm,
the answers for why she did the things she did. I wasn't able to interview her. She
sure.
long ago. Um, but by writing her story, I'm hoping shed light on someone, challenged her own assumptions, leading herself into the world. As a caregiver and an ally of the disability rights movement, I didn't know much about disability until my sister encountered it. And
Mm,
we've found that it largely comes down to attitudes that are based on fear and ignorance. Um, I kind of liken it to the Matrix. Hear me out here. It's just that these barriers, they're all around us, but
mm,
unless you are attuned to them, you can't necessarily perceive them. Like a curb cut, for example, or a poorly constructed sidewalk. You just don't think about what that might feel like to travel over with an assistive device until you experience that. So um, I find just as a caregiver, the extra precautions you need to take to think about accessibility when obviously no one else has, that's something that Beryl and many, many others were forced to do. They were forced into becoming activists. They didn't choose this as a career choice or something. That daily experience of facing those barriers, that's something that certainly informs the assumptions that you have.
Mentioned something interesting here. You said that you didn't really know much about her before researching her. Is part of that also because there is a lack of sources and resources about her life outside of what was, publicly displayed in the interviews in the activism? I have to admit, I know very little. Before reading your book, I knew very little about her life as well, right? So I'm genuinely asking you, like, is there a lack of sources on that front, or?
Not necessarily. So I already
Okay.
knew much about the history of the disability rights movement. So this
Right.
emerged out of my graduate work, which became my first working towards equity on the history of the disability movement. And through that
Mhm.
education, self-education in a way, I learned that there were very much two different camps at that time. There's multiple disability rights movements, so to speak, or disability movements. And so finding someone who straddled multiple. That was a unique person, someone who wasn't obviously in this camp or that camp. And actually, to her credit, that became uh, part of what defined her legacy was her ability to. David Baker of the Arch Disability Law Center talked to me about her role in helping bring all of these different disparate and arguing and infighting organizations together and motivating them to action, but you can only do that sometimes when you are sort of an every person. You're to everyone. You're
Mhm.
able to gather all those perspectives and just say, let's go do it. She's very boots on the ground type of activist, so
Right.
she wanted to gather those sentiments and like, okay, let's go and do it. That was her style.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, well, this was a question I had planned for later, but I guess I can ask it now in this case, where you mentioned at the start that her career as an activist kind of spanned like 2.5 decades, really, almost three
Yeah.
decades. Um, and it's interesting how you can see through her time as an activist the changes in demands and approaches to disability rights in Canada. So, can you speak a little bit more to that, or a bit more into detail about how, or at least how these demands or how these approaches changed from the 70s to now ish, right? We're more or less the 90s when she, in the last days of her activism. Yeah, how did that change, and how central was she to those different types of demands and changes?
Yeah, so with Beryl, she is not like the disability activist. In fact, there's no such
Mhm.
thing, and probably can't be in Canada because we have such systems that are very provincially dictated in terms of the resources and systems that are set up. They're controlled by the provinces. So in terms of how her approach evolved, I mean, in many ways, the demands of the disability rights movement have not changed. They're basically what everyone wants. I think it was that phrase, a home, a job, and a friend.
Pretty
You
much.
know,
Yeah.
they've always been looking for safe and accessible place to call home, an occupation paid for those who want and are able to do that, the ability to get around, social and recreational opportunities, and for people to treat them with respect and dignity. So in the beginning, yes, Beryl was really focused on creating recreational opportunities because where she lived in Scarborough at the time, which is like a borough east of Toronto, there just weren't that many things. But she quickly realized that this is not just recreational opportunities. When members started trickling in and communicating their problems to her, and she started taking it upon herself to advocate for them, she realized this is not just about recreation. This is about all those other things I just mentioned. And those things should be fairly easy to address, but it hasn't been. It's been quite hard, and that's obviously because for most of our history, we have literally constructed physical and social spaces that have excluded people with disabilities. So I mean, at the same time we were building residential schools, they were building residential hospitals to like literally contain and exclude an entire population of people. Um, so I mean, oh, actually, I did want to do a shout out for a great podcast that's out there that explores this topic, which is Megan Linton's Invisible Institutions, and she explores the ways in which that institutionalization I just discussed has continued in many forms. So, you know, by the 50s, we have the beginnings of the community living movement, um, but you know, these things are still with us today in many ways. And since then, I think the central theme of disability rights activism has been about taking back control over people's lives and being able to message that to a broader audience, controlling the message as well. So that was obviously something Beryl was fighting for time and really does continue.
And um, you mentioned this in like your introduction to the book as a whole, but you know, Potter faced a bunch of different issues from an early age, right? You start the book actually with a really interesting description of some of the problems that she faces as a child. So you can say, in a sense, almost that she spent almost her whole life struggling, or at least fighting in some way, shape, or form for uh, people with disabilities, right? By her very existence. And I'm curious in this case if there's a particular moment or what instance encouraged her to take matters into her own hands, so to speak. You alluded to it in your introduction, but can you say a little bit more about what really changed in her life that said, okay, this is enough. We need to fight for what's right in this case?
Mhm. Yeah, her story is interesting in that she lived the first 40 years of her life as an able-bodied uh, mother of three. She admitted later she'd never really thought about disability before her accident. And in fact, that is how most people, I think, you know, they don't think about disability and until it affects them directly. And so really she was dropped into the world of disability activism in her 40s. She just had never encountered those barriers I discussed earlier. And I think, you know, for those who can experience what that juxtaposition is like, I think it was that essential contrast between like, really, this is how people are forced to live, like to accept this daily scrutiny and discrimination and seeing the injustice of that, I think was quite a motivation for her. And channeling all of the other injustices and struggles and hardships that she had up to that point, I think it just was like a bottle of soda and pop rocks inside of her, and it was just shooken up and it exploded. She became this amazing dynamic advocate on the stage, and but she needed those experiences to help hone
Mm.
her and help her give her lessons about resiliency and the ability to make her voice known. Like she didn't know she could do that. She was very shy before, and yet she had this dynamic personality afterwards. So I think it really was that essential juxtaposition that led her to maybe I should start a rec group. Oh, look at all these problems. I need to solve these problems. People shouldn't be, you know, forced to live like this. And so and then on and on from there. I really think that's what motivated her, that juxtaposition.
Absolutely. And is this something, because you will sometimes hear this criticism in when people come in from, I want to say, like an outsider
Mm,
perspective, right? Coming into a rights group or anything like that, you'll sometimes hear this criticism that these people only start caring when it happens to them, kind of like you mentioned, rather than, you know, leaving people who have lived with this for their whole lives to fight for
mm,
a perspective that sometimes attracts them more directly or impacts them more directly. I'm not
mm,
saying I agree necessarily with this type of criticism, but you do hear it
sure.
once in a while. And is this kind of leads me to a wider question of what kind of criticism would have Beryl received during her life as an activist, if any at all? And was it related in any way to her approaches or anything like
Yeah, I think if there was any criticism of her, it actually was that she may have been a little bit outdated according to the
that?
vanguard
Interesting.
of disability rights activists. So I address this in the book.
Hmm.
By the 1970s and 80s, this is when a lot of disability rights activists were forming their groups, and they were informed by social movements of that time. Um, Beryl
Civil
was
rights
born in the
activism.
yeah, civil rights activism and women's liberation and all of these sorts of things, even gay liberation, the sort of taking to the streets. Beryl was born again in the 1920s, so she was technically of an earlier generation. She had only recently acquired her disability. So as Tracy O'Dell who's a disability activist, she mentioned in the book, her approach and her mindset was different than many other activists. And I personally feel that her age and her experiences were very different from many other disability activists of the time. She had very positive experiences with service agency because they had helped her set up her rec club, and so she had no reason to fight them. She supported the Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Telethon. That's like, you do not do that in the disability rights community because, I mean, you can look it up, but Jerry Lewis trafficked a lot of negative stereotypes of disability. And it just goes to show that while she was promoting awareness and using this sort of soft approach to building empathy, which she felt was necessary in our culture, this very broad project, when it came to disability policy, all she knew is that she needed to get out there and protest because this was good for the disability community. She was not necessarily at the vanguard at that time. And so I think it's important people realize that as well. This is just one woman's story, but it's a very
Exactly.
fully formed story of a whole person and not just this very inspirational fluff triumph over disability type narrative that is often
Yeah.
populating bookshelves, which I don't agree
Mhm.
with.
No, and that's kind of one of the things I appreciated about the book was that, first of all, it's not a puff piece, as you were saying,
Yeah.
but also the acknowledgement that these fights don't happen in a vacuum, right?
Mm.
Which I think history writing has been better geared towards on a general in a general way, but I think it's always refreshing and nice to see it in a book like yours that is meant, I believe, at least in the way I was reading it, that is meant for a wider audience.
Sure.
So I really appreciated that, and your allusions or your direct references to other people in her life or in the activism field, I think, is a very important move in history writing and one that points to the dynamic notions that history is made of, I think,
Yeah.
in and of itself.
It's
So,
connected.
yeah, just thought that was cool. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah, and how it's connected, I was going to say,
Yes.
and how those different, I mean, the task of disability historians like me, like other social historians before me, is to read disability into history because it's so often not included. And so there's this, I'm so glad to be part of this growing field of disability history, although I've obviously made a very deliberate attempt to speak to a broader audience, not just an academic audience, but it's finding disability in history because it's there, it always has been there, but you just have to
Mhm.
read against the grain to find it. And that's what I think all especially academic historians are trained to do, right?
Right. And it's interesting because my partner is working in her own studies within the field of medical humanities, what they call medical humanities, which I feel is connected, if not exactly the same thing to what you're talking about, of looking for the ways in which um, medical issues or medicine as a concept was often either just taken for granted, in this case in the literature, as an English major, but just I assume it can apply just as easily into the history field as well. Um, and just for listeners who might not be as well versed in the academic field, like, can you speak a little bit to how you go about kind of researching against the grain, so to speak? Like, what do you look for? How do you look for what's not there? To put it kind of in a general sense.
Yeah, so I mean, you can begin with what exists,
Mm,
and then kind of work backward from there. So I mean, like I guess this is getting more academic, but one of
sure.
my first articles I wrote about was on like fraternal insurance. Okay, so this was a form of insurance that existed before standard life insurance companies today, for-profit insurance. These insurance that were cooperative, and so a lot of Odd Fellows, International Force types of groups would have insurance companies. And so I tried to figure out, well, what happened to these fraternal insurance companies? So they can't just have ceased to exist. And so by reading backwards from there, I discovered, well, actually, this had a lot to do with injured workers and other forms of disability, the impact of disability on people's families. A lot of that stuff is there, but someone who wrote the history of the insurance industry necessarily didn't see the people with disabilities inside of those histories. And then it's a matter of, drilling down on the stories that are interesting, finding the commonalities. And so I found that, it's finding a topic that that interests you, that is underserved, and then drilling down. I just find, at least maybe it's just me, but drilling down into the details, you just find, wow, this is like a story within a story. It's like a matryoshka dollar. I think that's what they're called. You just keep unpacking them, and there's something interesting at the core. And that's actually what I did with Beryl too, because part of the challenge in as a historian writing the history of the disability rights movement or people with disabilities is that there hasn't been a lot of change, frankly, in a lot of key factors. I mean, first book, Working Towards Equity, was about the labor movement. Well, how do you write the history of 50% plus unemployment of people with disabilities since, forever?
Yeah.
And so I found that's partly what led me to biography, so that at least I could chart the course of one woman's life and how it intersected with disability rights. Um, and I found that to be a very interesting practice. And so maybe I'm a biographer now. I don't know.
No, but it is a point worth making um, when people who are not necessarily well versed in research, which is fine. Like that's just not how like um, how some people come to the world. But it is something that's hard to balance, right? How do you talk about a wider issue while still being specific enough and focused enough that it's comprehensive? Because otherwise, if you were uh, not going to be that specific, you'd end up writing a 2,000-page book that is
Right.
just sprawling and would take 2 decades to write, possibly, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it becomes untenable as a project. And I think, despite some of the um, issues that people might have with biography as a form, right, when approaching a topic like this, I think it's an incredibly efficient and effective, perhaps a better word, to approach this particular topic of disability rights in Canada. Yeah, nice.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
it's nice.
no, go ahead, please.
Yeah, yeah, but it's an interesting way to approach. Some of my um, kind of author mentors would be Laura Hillenbrand, Stacy Schiff, Rosemary Sullivan as well here in Canada. Their way of uh, finding finding the history and context within an existing, even sometimes a well-known story, is super interesting to find. I had to unlearn a few academic writing habits along the way. It just even dealing with our editors to no, but they need all this context, because if I don't put the context in, but when you're telling a story of someone's life,
Mm.
there sometimes extra details can get in the way. So it's a matter of finding the opportunities to provide context within it, and that enriches it and not distracts from the main point of just keep that story rolling. So that's something I've had to learn, as going from an academic historian to more of a creative nonfiction writer.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the questions I had, but you kind of already answered it in this, right? The writing style is much closer to what you'd see in creative nonfiction, as you're saying. And
Yeah.
it makes both the book more approachable, but also forces you to, you know, get to the point perhaps a bit more directly in many ways than you would in an academic book. So yeah, very good. I'm always reminded of the Kurt Vonnegut quote in this case, where he was talking about writing short stories, and you have to start at the last possible second, right? And I feel
Mm,
like you've managed to accomplish that in this particular book, even if obviously it's not fiction, like Vonnegut
yeah.
was talking about,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
the mentality remains, I
True.
think. Um, so just getting into some of the more how could I say aftermath aspects of Beryl's life. So she died in 1998, if I remember correctly,
Mhm.
and which isn't that long ago in the grand scheme of history, right? Less than 30 years ago. Um, and do you feel like, um, yeah, in what ways do you feel like her journey, right, or her life as an activist, or even her personal life, are still relevant to us today? And I ask that mostly because before reading this book, I had very little idea about who she was as a
Mm.
person, right? I knew of the picture that, as you were talking about, like the cover, or at least I had seen pictures that were similar of
Mhm.
her in front of plenty of mics, but I couldn't really say much about her life. And I feel like, unfortunately, she's been somewhat forgotten by people of, I'll say, my generation ish, who didn't necessarily grow up with her on the news, as you were saying. And that might be reflective of her impact today. I don't know, but maybe you can enlighten us and the listeners about in what ways she's perhaps still relevant despite not being as well known.
Well, I do think she's still relevant, and that's only because possibly because all of the things that she's been advocating for 35, 40 years ago are just as relevant today, as I mentioned. Those things have not gone away. But I, I think part of the reason why this book and she matters today is
Mhm.
because of what you just mentioned. You didn't know anything about her. I bet you couldn't name any other disability activist. In Canada, I mean, I'm not challenging you to name any, but
No, I just can't.
yeah, you just can't. Well, in Canada, especially, our name recognition of important disabled Canadians really begins and ends with, say, Terry Fox, Rick Hansen,
Oh,
maybe Michael J. Fox is a current example, but there aren't many examples that people can just, oh, that person, and how they shaped our history. So I personally feel like rescuing her story from the shadows is just like the first step in hopefully creating an appetite for more stories like this, because I really do strongly feel that we need to know disability activists. We need to know how they've shaped our history, because they've shaped our built environment, our culture, the way we do things, the way we structure, even digitally. You know, why if we accept these things into our culture, don't you want to know the people that helped bring these achievements to fruition? And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do with the book, and why I think that, Beryl is definitely relevant today. But she's not the only one. She's just one of thousands of people, as I said, who have been forced to advocate for themselves. There's lots of stories out there. This isn't the only one, and I'm hoping it's just a start.
and continuing on that idea a little bit, we've talked about this a little bit before starting to record, but recently Canada passed a rather important bill as far as disability rights are concerned.
Mm,
Bill C-22, which, if memory serves, passed royal assent in June or July
mm.
of this year. Um, and can you speak a little bit as to what this bill is and why it's important to disability rights in Canada, and perhaps how Beryl might, or how it might fit in with the kind of narrative about Beryl Potter that we've been talking about?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so this is the Canada Disability Benefit. Um, I think that targets working age Canadian to help them cover unexpected expenses. Well, um, poverty and unemployment have obviously been very long-standing issues in the disability community. Beryl fought against that in her time, and that work is just as relevant today. I personally feel that if we want to know about a piece of legislation that affects uh, a minority community or any specific community, you should be
Mhm.
going to that community to see what those activists or those leaders of that community are saying about it, like as a beginning point, because that hasn't happened enough in the disability community. And so in this case, you could navigate over to the AODA Alliance, where late David Lepofsky is saying how it's very well intentioned, but is ultimately weak in that it doesn't address a number of issues. And that actually is the central theme in disability policy: is well-meaning policy or legislation that sounds good, sometimes is repackaged at the end or beginning of an electoral cycle, um,
Naturally.
naturally, and but is ultimately weak. So I mean, Beryl was fighting against stuff like that in her time. She fought against the Federal Employment Equity Bill in the late
Mhm.
80s because it was weak. It's a voluntary bill, it's not mandatory, and targets are quite arbitrary in many ways. So that is a central theme: well-intentioned but weak legislation, and that you could ask any disability activist from now or through history, and they would say the same. So I think that,
It's almost
as
paternalistic. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a way of attracting voters sometimes, or placating dissension. In the past, there's been a lot more disability advocacy, and that's because the state was more of an activist state. It invested in funding disability organizations. At least some parts of the state felt that these are important channels for understanding what cities are telling you. But over time, certainly since the 80s, there's been a reduction in state funding to disability organizations like that. And it was almost completely erased in the 1990s with our Common Sense Revolution in Ontario. So that's been a
Right.
challenge for sure. But I think we should stay tuned to disability activists, Council of Canadians with Disabilities, AODA Alliance, these sorts of organizations. See what they're saying about legislation. Form our assumptions from there.
Sure. And um,
Or do
I
our
always
research.
liked, yeah, basically, right. And that's always something we encourage on the show. Like, there's only so much that we can talk about in a discussion like this, or that's accessible through a single book, for example, as deeply researched as it may be. So, yeah, absolutely. Talk to the people that are actually, uh,
Yeah.
involved in this. Shocker.
Yeah, exactly. That's a politician's answer, is it? I don't know.
Yeah, possibly, but it doesn't matter. It's still
Or
effective.
a
There's a
historian's
reason why
answer.
it works.
Historian's answer. It's always complicated, right?
Yeah. So the one of the last things I always like to ask people in interviews is if there's a particular passage or section that stands out to their own work for them. And if you want to read that section, that's obviously a good place to do it if you want. But yeah, just to give the listeners a sense of how this book is written or what its major ideas are, perhaps through that passage.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell a few stories if you're interested, or a couple stories that are relevant.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, the one that everyone seems to be gravitating to is the time she like maybe assaulted the prime minister. Maybe that's a good place to start. That
By
would
all
be,
means.
yeah. So that's Prime Minister Mulroney. So this is actually in the employment equity context that I was speaking about. So the government introduced the bill to pass federal employment equity legislation in the late 1980s. And again, it was not mandatory. There was no enforcement. And so Beryl helped form a coalition of activists. And actually, Judy Rebick, who wrote the foreword to this book, and she's a very well-known feminist activist, said this is actually one of the first times that the disability community has led a cross-social movement protest. And that's actually quite significant in that fact. So anyway, so Beryl and a few activists go down to Ottawa to try to secure a meeting with Prime Minister Mulroney to express their opposition to the having trouble pinning him down, of course, very busy and whatnot. So they got a tip off that he used a specific back hallway from the House of Commons to a cabinet meeting room. And so they get set up to intercept him. I don't know if this still happens today. I can't imagine with all the security.
Absolutely still happens.
So they're waiting in this hallway, and he strides up to them, maybe thinking it could be a photo op because there's nothing on the schedule. But then when he sees Beryl and then obviously Judy, who's very well known, he realized this is not a photo op. This is something else. And when he got close enough, instead of just making their demands known, Beryl used her only arm to reach up and grab him and say, you promised us a meeting. Yeah, you were going to, listen to our demands. Why isn't this legislation? And la la la. She went on and on. And everyone was a little bit shocked, and maybe just because of who she was, no one intervened. She maybe doesn't look that threatening, but until you get to know her. So eventually they secured a meeting with his top policy person. But I mean, none of their demands were included in discussions or parts of the bill. So they ended up leading, 150 demonstrators to Ottawa, and they even made a ruckus inside the House of Commons. So it's just this kind of story is indicative of her very brazen style of activism at some points that wasn't very commonly understood at the time as something that this isn't how people with disabilities look on TV. It's like, you know, assaulting the prime or grabbing the prime minister and making a ruckus in the House of Commons. So that was the persona that she brought. But for me, if I can just tell one more story,
Of course.
I actually my favorite story from the book is the time she was awarded the Order of Canada. And this is obviously our country's highest civilian honor. It usually recognizes a lifetime of work in a particular field. And for her, it was a lifetime of work in disability activism. So I'm not sure how it's done nowadays, but back when she won, this was towards the end of her life in the mid 90s. They had an awards ceremony at the Royal Alexandra Theatre on King Street in downtown Toronto. And actually, Stompin' Tom Connors, who's a country music star, folk legend, he tells the story best. This is a very like straight-laced, people have their tuxedos on and champagne flutes, and I can just imagine this, sort of haughty atmosphere, maybe a bit tense because, there's very important Canadians in this room. And so I'm not a country music star. I love folk music. I'm a Dolly Parton fan. But he doesn't dress like that. He wears his, cowboy hat and his cowboy boots, and he strolls up to Beryl and he's like, "Do you ever give people a ride on that thing?" And she's like, "Yeah, sure, hop on." And he sits down and he thought she maybe go a few feet, but she like kicks it into high gear and starts doing circles around this big party, and he's throwing his cowboy hat and yelling, "Hi ho, Silver, get out of the way." And it just was this party. It just broke the ice, and they had a party after that. But that's where Mr. Connor's story ends. But actually, the evening continued because next door there was the dinner reception, and so as everyone's making their way in all their gowns and tuxedos over to Ed's warehouse, which was Ed Mirvish set up a steakhouse because there wasn't many restaurants in the area at the time. Um, but there's a couple steps to get in, and then there's a couple flights of stairs to get up to the steakhouse. Well, obviously, someone's gonna bring her in through the back door, or, although she wouldn't like that, she was ready to tell someone, I wouldn't appreciate being taken in through the back. But as time ticks by, it's clear that no one has thought about how she's supposed to get into the restaurant. This is a completely inaccessible place to hold a reception. And just the irony of that, her being celebrated for her lifetime of activism at the end of her life, and no one thought about how she's supposed to get in to celebrate with everyone else. They tried to, request, "Oh, we'll just carry you up a couple stairs, a couple flights of stairs." She's like, "Absolutely not. I'm not falling out of my chair." So she asks her son Dennis to go and get the car, and as she's being loaded in, a limousine pulls up behind her, and it's Governor General Romeo LeBlanc, who wonders why she's leaving so early, and obviously later realizes that there's been a terrible oversight here, and there's apologies, and eventually the air clears. And she tells them, like, the next time you hold an event like this, make sure you think of people with disabilities. And hopefully they do now, all these years after the fact. But it was that irony of her at the end of her life having to fight this, like it didn't even take a break for her to be able to celebrate for one night. And I think a lot of people can resonate with what that feels like. And so that for me, that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, especially that Tom Connors one. I remember laughing quite vocally when I read that. But yeah, these are just a snippet, of course, of what is ultimately an almost 400-page book on her life. That is 300 actually, not 400, but
yeah, don't give me more credit.
On yeah, exactly. But yeah, and I highly encourage, of course, people to read it because there's a lot more stories that are just as interesting as the ones you were telling. The last thing that I want to ask, and this is not one that I sent to you ahead of time because I always ask it to all my guests. Is there anything that I didn't ask in this interview? And what's the answer to that question?
I think you didn't. Well, you know, there are a few things that I hope people take away from the book. Did you ask that, or was I not?
No, I didn't ask. Go
Okay,
ahead.
okay. Well, so there are a few things that three main things, and we've actually already mentioned this one, which is that I think we really need more disability activists to know important disabled Canadian how they have affected our history. I think that should be almost part of being a Canadian citizen, understanding how important movements have shaped our history, and that it's clear when people cannot name ability who's affected our history. So I hope people take that away and search for other stories. And the other thing is that children really should be exposed to positive representations of just to nurture that empathy. And it's because Beryl really bet her life work on children. She's a firm believer in that. She even had Terry Fox was already very popular back in the early 80s. So when she would tour around to school, she had her Ford van look like, it probably wasn't coincidental. It looked exactly like the Van of Hope. Same model, same tan color, everything, because people recognize that van for the. So finding ways to just expose children to people with disability, not afraid of them, and then trying to nurture that throughout their life. I honestly believe in that's possible. And the last thing is that we live in a very death and disavoidant culture, but by avoiding these topics, we have perhaps inadvertently or purposefully created systems that are riddled with gaps and problems. Beryl spent the latter half of her life just trying to get people's attention on these issues because she felt through attention will hopefully some sort of change. She was quite disillusioned by the end of all of the broken promise, false hope and empty talk that politicians and leaders would offer. So we need to just continue looking at those gaps and listening to people with disabilities and activists, how we need to resolve those. There's problems that have not gone away, and they won't just magically go away. But I think having a more well-informed population that can access the true feeling of stories of people's lives like Beryl, I think will hopefully engender more support and motivation to change.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, a wonderful place to end it on in this case. I'll be sure to include all of the websites and resources that you mentioned throughout the show, the podcast. I'll include them all in the description. I think it's very important and fits in with what you were saying at the end. But Dustin, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me today and talking about this unfortunately underrepresented historical figure. Right. Is the book already out for listeners who might be interested in reading it?
Yes. Yep. Yes, it is. Yeah, you can either go to btlbooks.com or my website, dustingaler.com.
Again, links in the description. So thank you very much. And, I hope to probably have you on the show again whenever you release another book.
There's another one coming, so stay tuned.
Awesome. Thank you
Okay.
so much.